Video games. Many of us grew up with them. This is a story of how video games became part of our daily lives.
The Famicom and its Western counterpart, the NES, had an incredible library.
It goes without saying that the Atari 2600 was made with
Bill
very
Gates was reluctant to release
In the
Xbox.
Philippines, some chose Xbox 360, while some stayed loyal to the
Those
PlayStation.
were the days of epic battles and endless debates.
Without going too far into history, it can be shown that play is an important part of human lives. Children play to learn and entertain themselves, while adults play to relax and to socialize. One of these earliest video game was the 1972 classic Pong.
Pong was one of the most popular arcade games back in the 1970s. It started off in about 1972, and it was extremely simple in its setup. A black screen, two paddles, and a blip that served as a ball that got bounced between one paddle to the other, moving faster and faster every time it got hit. And any time that one of the paddles missed, it scored a point for your opponent. You and a buddy would play both paddles, and it was like a game of tennis where you would bounce a ball between each other, but the ball would move faster and faster. You and a buddy, and oftentimes your gang in the back, they were cheering you on, trying to reach that ball before it went out of the screen and scored a point for your opponent. The relative simplicity was addictive, and yet it was something that people really latched onto back in the early days of the arcade, back in the 70s, and a lot of people might stand to benefit from something like that nowadays because simplicity is often one of the things that people are missing when it comes to their gameplay.
Two of the most common ways to play Pong was at the arcades, of which there were plenty in the Philippines. The other was one of the earliest home consoles to hit the Philippines, the Atari 2600.
It goes without saying that the Atari 2600 was made with very basic parts, and that's why there came out the ColecoVision and the Intellivision.
Introducing ColecoVision's first expansion module that lets you play all Atari 2600 compatible cartridges.
In Television 2, add the new system changer and play all Atari 2600 games.
Interchangeability was one of the things that people tried to achieve back then, and they manufactured parts that actually allowed you to play games from one console to the other. Atari games on a ColecoVision. Imagine that. Imagine that happening nowadays, that some PlayStation games might be compatible or be able to play on an Xbox, or Xbox games on a Nintendo Switch. Back then, that was something that people tried to achieve. That's not something that people try to do now, but interoperability, compatibility was something big back in the day because people wanted to get more value from their consoles and from their games.
That means you can play more games than any other video game system.
Another arcade game that got really popular during the time, around 1978-1979, was a game called Space Invaders. It was one where you had simple graphics of a ship that shot lasers up onto aliens coming down from space, and they were shooting lasers at you too. You would keep playing and try to achieve a high score before your ship ultimately got destroyed. The game was different in that you were trying to achieve a high score as opposed to trying to beat your opponent. Space Invaders was very much a single player game. And it got so popular in the arcades that urban legend has it that Japan actually ran short of coins for a time because people kept using those coins to play Space Invaders in the arcade. I know, it was subsequently disproven, but it was a fun little thought nevertheless that people would get so addicted and have so much fun with Space Invaders that they would keep plunking down coins into that arcade slot so that they could keep playing more and more and achieve that high score.
Why buy just a video game from Atari or Intellivision? Invest in the wonder computer of the 1980s for under $300. The Commodore VIC-20. Unlike games, it has a real computer keyboard.
If all else fails, there's one last thing you can try. Get him an Apple of his own.
The Commodore 64 Family Pack, a value of $700 for just $499.
Are you keeping up with the Commodore? 'Cause the Commodore's keeping up with you.
Nevertheless, there were powerhouses that came out back in the late 80s on the PC. A game that got developed in Soviet Russia was called Tetris, and it came as a pack-in game for the Nintendo Game Boy as well later on. Anybody who's ever heard that music, you know the music, and sees those blocks coming down from the ceiling down to your pile, knows that it's time to start piling up those blocks and make them disappear.
So during the 70s, video games from Japan and America made their way in the Philippine market and almost instantly made their way also into the hearts of kids. So the reception was really positive, but like in every major story, there's always a plot twist. Educators and parents seem to express some concern that video games might corrupt these young minds. So, of course, taking action, then Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Sr. dropped a decree bomb in 1981, banning all sorts of video games, or even going to the extent of destroying anything video game related. 5 years of no video games. It was really hard for any local gaming enthusiast. And it wasn't until the administration was overturned in the aftermath of the 1986 EDSA revolution that the ban on video games was lifted. So, happiness all around.
The next big revolution in video games in the Philippines happened with the coming of the Nintendo Famicom, or NES as it was known in the West. People had a few years to get used to the graphics of the Atari, so when the Famicom was introduced, it was a quantum leap from the blocky graphics that were the norm back then.
The Famicom and its Western counterpart, the NES, had an incredible library of titles with more than a handful of gems. Most, fortunately, were never able to set foot outside of Japan. That wasn't a problem for gamers, of course, and we were still able to acquire them and really grasp the gameplay of many Japanese exclusives, despite not understanding any Japanese. Games like Sky Destroyer, Formation Z, and Highway Star, they redefined the gaming industry, really embrace gaming passionately and somewhat addictively. The demand for gaming skyrocketed, giving birth to a lot of NES clones or family clones that are still available to this day. I remember back in the 90s in the Philippines, if you have a household with a video game console, somehow becomes the official hangout spot in the neighborhood. Filipinos, always on the lookout for better opportunities, somehow took this to a next level, giving birth to local video game console rental shops, or computeran as we call them. Kids would frequent these pay-to-play stores to play or just watch and soak in all those good gaming vibes. It was like a small, vibrant community where everyone shared the joy of game. It was good times. The 16-bit era was defined by Sega Nintendo, and it was actually a gaming and marketing battleground between these two industry titans. Not to bore you with all the details, but long story short, Sega released the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive, and then Nintendo fired back with Super Nintendo a year later. You know, being a gamer during the 90s, it was a tough decision to make, and one that really sparked a full-on console war. Imagine having Sonic the Hedgehog go toe-to-toe with Mario for popularity, or games like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat being released for both consoles, and you know, like pouring gasoline over fire. It really ignited heated debates and gaming battles over which version is better.
Out of all the consoles that generation, Nintendo and Sega had most shares of the global market, with either brands claiming each country where that console prevailed. But the playing field was about to change again.
It was during the 1991 Consumer Electronics Show. Sony said they partnered with Nintendo to come up with disc-based games for the SNES. However, Nintendo, being paranoid of Sony's intentions to cut through their profit margins, announced that they will be allied with Philips instead. Who would have thought that Philips would be in the picture? So due to the betrayal by Nintendo, Sony came up with a console 3 years later. It is known as this baby right here, the Sony PlayStation. Although this is not the first release, of course, but I'm sure you guys get it.
Piracy is generally an issue of economics. You either can't afford a game so you pirate it, or you can't get the game because you don't have access to it.
With Philips and Sony introducing CD technology, it became very easy to duplicate and distribute bootlegs CD-based software. Alternative software sellers popped up at almost every corner in every mall here in the Philippines during the late 90s. Us being Filipinos, most people preferred buying the bootleg copies instead. Remember these? I remember buying 7 C's CDs back in the day, worth 50 pesos each CD. The burn with the pencil markings, and then we have here the ones with the fancy print on top. Of course, PlayStation wasn't the only victim to this. Even PC software became victims of this act.
Software piracy was running rampant in the Philippines that the government tried to regulate and persecute violators. It hardly made any difference even until this day. By the early 2000s, Sony's next juggernaut, the PlayStation 2, was deemed the king of that generation. Due to the PlayStation 2's DVD and technical capabilities, Windows developer Microsoft saw Sony as a threat to personal computers.
So we go into the meeting, and 4 o'clock, Valentine's Day, Bill walks in. He's holding our deck, PowerPoint deck, throws it down on the table, and he says, "This is a blanking insult to everything I've done at this company."
Oh, Bill Gates was reluctant to release Xbox, but eventually Microsoft came out with Xbox in 2001 to compete against Sony's PS2. Sales were modest at best. Despite that, the team persisted to continue, and then they achieved more success with the Xbox 360. Xbox Live became the better digital service than the PlayStation Network.
Well, despite the technological specs of both PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, both systems have their own hiccups during their initial years of release. Sony and Microsoft were in a rush to outdo each other in terms of production, and each company had to cut corners to get ahead.
I'm outside the Best Buy in Midtown. It's raining here in New York, but these gamers don't care. They've been out here in the rain since early this morning, and they're not leaving until they get an Xbox 360.
Just check out this lineup of customers just waiting for the crack of dawn. That's when 21 PS3 consoles will hit store shelves, and despite the weather, they say it's worth the overnight wait.
Microsoft hasn't specified the cause, but some faulty Xbox 360s are literally melting down while running certain games.
So, an entertainment console built to last. So why are so many of these first PS3s fighting the dust?
LED was banned to be used in electronic devices in 2006. LED has a high melting point. Take that away, you have to use LED-free components, and this ultimately caused overheating of both consoles, which by design were not sufficient to handle that kind of heat. We call it the lights of death. Sony at first said all faulty units can be replaced if still under warranty. Replaced, not repair. Microsoft, on the other hand, remedied the situation by telling the owners to send all faulty 360s back to be repaired, all of them for free. And it cost Microsoft $1 billion just for that. It's funny how the 7th generation of consoles was defined by these lights of death. But Microsoft came out the better than Sony in terms of customer service.
The next generation doesn't start until we say it does.
Microsoft wanted to pull Sony down a peg, and arguably, they did it with the 360. In the Philippines, some chose Xbox 360 as the superior device, while some stayed loyal to the PlayStation. The balance shifted again against Sony's favor when they were hacked in 2011.
Sony has confirmed that hackers broke into its PlayStation network
after suffering what the company called an external intrusion.
Sony felt the humiliation again this time because of their hubris, but they are not out yet. At the 2013 Electronic Entertainment Expo, Sony announced the PlayStation 4 and basically said that everything that Microsoft's next console, Xbox One, was not.
We're equally focused on delivering what gamers want most, without imposing restrictions or devaluing their PS4 purchases.
Gamers from E3 and who watched the telecast at home were convinced that the PS4 was the better console since Xbox One was very anti-consumer. What happened days after? Microsoft said they are no longer doing the stuff they said at E3. You only have one chance to make a good impression. Microsoft, they blew it. To make things worse for Xbox, Final Fantasy VII Remake was announced on the PlayStation 4 first. Everyone went nuts. Between the lifespans of the PS4 and Xbox One, Microsoft trailed behind Sony.
And so Microsoft initially believed that the Xbox should also cross the Pacific and make a significant dent in the Japanese market. And they were able to sign in some Japanese game developers, while the others were more apprehensive on dealing with the Americans.
They were kind of perceived as the bad guy coming into the Japanese market, kind of invading the homeland and competing with Sony and Nintendo.
Not to mention the Japanese gaming community, they were indifferent with Western-style games. Microsoft saw the low numbers and the Japanese gaming sensibilities did not sit well with them either.
Microsoft had other plans. Let's buy out other Western gaming developers. Make more exclusive games only for Xbox. Xbox already have Fable, Forza, Halo, Gears of War. They bought Bethesda in 2021, effectively owning Fallout and Elder Scrolls. They bought Activision Blizzard in 2022, effectively owning Call of Duty and World of Warcraft. By doing so, Microsoft can focus more investments on the westernized and English-speaking countries. Japan is not the only gaming market in Asia. Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, and even the Philippines are more accommodating to Xbox.
Some would say the console wars rage on with PlayStation and Microsoft Xbox duking it out every generation with PlayStation 3 versus Xbox 360 and PlayStation 5 versus Microsoft Series X. Characters are created and revived as needed, and numerous sales and discounts happen as a consequence. Because of this, we as gamers benefit, and all we have to do is enjoy everything that has to come before, and everything also that is to come. History isn't just what happened before, it is also what's in the making, and you, the audience, are all part of it. We invite you to join us in our journey through it at the Shuffle Emporium, Studio PH, and Retro Unlimited booth.